Oh, well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start this final plenary session. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague in many ways, DeRay Mckesson, to come join us today and share his insights with us.
It's an honor to be here.
So what I thought I would do first, because I know a lot of my colleagues don't know who DeRay is or what he's done in the past and so forth. So we're going to run a little clip that's running in the African American Museum, in the new African American Museum in Washington, D.C. So we're going to run it real quick, and then we'll go back and start our presentation. That was pretty powerful. That was pretty amazing to see.
The thing about Colbert is that Colbert is exactly like that in the hallway, like everywhere. He's like always in character. It's so interesting.
So how does a kid from Baltimore end up being invited to the White House many times, sitting on Stephen Colbert, being played in the African American Museum? What is it about your history, and where have you come from to come to this place as a early 30-something-year-old leader?
Yeah, I think of myself as just one of many people who's committed to making the world a better place. I was a kid in Baltimore. I went to Bowdoin in Maine. Maine is a great place, a very white state, great nonetheless, and that was awesome. And then I taught sixth grade math in East New York, Brooklyn, which was one of the best things that I've ever done. Math was really good. Sixth grade is the best grade if you ever teach. Seventh grade is puberty and deodorant, and it is bad. But sixth grade is amazing. So I taught sixth grade math, and that really changed the way that I thought about disparities, because I was a teacher and I was math to so many kids in that community. I taught in Starrett City, which is the single largest housing project in the country, like as far east to New York as you possibly can go. And then I went back home to Baltimore, opened up an after-school center, trained and supported a third of all the new teachers in the city of Baltimore. And then I was the number 2 in human capital in the school system. I was the number 2 in human capital in Minneapolis Public Schools when Mike Brown got killed. And I started to be in the street in Ferguson, and that changed so much about the way we think about the world. So I think about those meetings with Obama were incredible. And I miss President Obama like everybody else does these days. I think about Colbert, and all of this has been about how do we help people both understand what the challenges are, but also understand what the solutions can be.
So what moves you in your heart to go to Ferguson? What was it about Mike Brown being killed in the street in Ferguson that took you to Ferguson, Missouri? What was it that motivated you?
Yeah, so I saw it on TV like everybody else probably did, and I saw what was happening on CNN, and I saw what was happening on Twitter, and they were just two very different stories. So I said, at the very least I can do on this weekend is go. So it was August 16th, I was sitting on my couch, and I was like, I'm just gonna go for the weekend. So I got in the car, I drove 9 hours, I put up a Facebook status and said, I don't know anybody in the state of Missouri, but if you know somewhere I can sleep, like, let me know. 7 hours in, I get this phone call being like, we found somebody who found somebody's couch you can sleep on. It's like, that's cool. And as I was driving down there, I remember I got sleepy. I stopped in Iowa in front of a church and just went to sleep in front of a church. But the second night I was in St. Louis was the first night that I was ever tear gassed, and I'll never forget it because it was this moment where I was like, this is just not the America that I thought I knew, and I committed myself to do whatever I can. If you remember those early days, you probably saw us marching on TV. And some people think that we marched in solidarity with the civil rights movement, that's why we were marching. It was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014, that if we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. That's why we marched, and I never forget that, because that is the not too distant past, right? They're like, that's pretty recent that it was illegal to stand still. And we took them to court and we won, but I'll never forget what it was like to have to march every single moment that we were outside because it was illegal to stand still.
So much of your work now, and I would call you pretty much a public intellectual in many ways, is based and grounded on data. But and facts really matter, though facts aren't really sexy. So what have you learned about how to use numbers to tell a story about what moves people to action?
Yeah, one of the things I never take for granted is that people understand the problem. And I remember in the early days, we were like, the police are killing people in Ferguson. Most people know Mike Brown's name, but the police killed 10 people after Mike, and you don't know any of their names. And we would go to different cities, or people call us, and they would be like, there's a problem in Ferguson. There's not a problem in my place. And we're like, no, there is a problem in your place. So we tried to figure out, how do we tell the story differently? So I think about my work is always trying to figure out, how can we give people language to talk about these things at the dinner table? So this year, there have only been 10 days where a police officer hasn't killed somebody. In America, a third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is killed by a police officer, which is wild, right? That is not how people think about the problem, but that is true. You think about the racial wealth gap. In 2044, we'll be a majority minority country, so there'll be more people of color than white people for the first time. But in 2053, the median wealth for black people will be $0. It'll be zero. That is wild. So how do we help people start to think about the scope and the enormity of the issues in ways that they can repeat? Because all of you can be experts on this stuff too. You're already experts in the field. And then how can we push people to not only see the problem, but think about like, how do we fix it at scale? That at this point, only the scaled solutions will be the things that save us. I even think about Baltimore. It just came out this morning that there are 13 schools in the city of Baltimore where no kid was proficient on math in any way that we tested it. Like that is wild, right? Like last year there were 6 schools that weren't proficient on anything that we tested. And like, how do we start to think about that and the systemic implications that renders us to understand?
So I know a lot of folks here don't know that you ran for mayor. And it was something that you'd had a passion for a long period of time. And you ran for mayor, you decided to run at the last minute, and you mounted quite an impressive campaign. And so, in your run for mayor of the city of Baltimore last year, you had an impressive platform that included a recognition of the social determinants of health and wellness. Can you share with us how you think municipalities should be approaching these issues?
Yeah, so I was most recently the chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore. So we, in the school system in Baltimore, we employ as many people as the city. It's a $1.3 billion organization. We have 11,000 employees and about 20,000 people in our health plan, all of our combined health plans. And as the chief human capital officer, I managed our health plans. And it was fascinating in so many ways because I'll never forget being in the room. We're in the room with our vendors, and I'm not going to call them out, but we're in the room with the vendors and the plan providers, and like it was shocking how hard it was to develop like a wellness plan that made sense. Like it just was like it was probably the single hardest thing I did as a chief human capital officer. Mind you, I'm the only person that can discipline people. Like I'm the only person that can fire and hire anybody in the district. I staffed every single school. All professional development that wasn't content rolled up to me, but healthcare also rolled up to me. And we'd sit in these rooms and I'm saying to all of our healthcare people, like the consultants, the providers, with 20,000 people, I'm like, help me think about wellness for our employee population. Granted, I have 200 buildings. So like if you want me to do Zumba at the main office, Zumba's not it. Zumba's gonna get me 20 people, they're gonna be a dedicated 20 people, but I have 11,000 employees. Like help me figure out how to do this across 200 buildings. And like the best minds in the room, and we called in everybody, and it was sort of a joke at the end. I would just like keep calling these healthcare meetings because like nobody could help us think about how to do wellness beyond one building. Like people, if I wanted to do like Fitbits at the central office, we had a plan. Flu shots at the central office, they had me. But anything that was like, how do we do 10 schools or 15 schools or anything in a coordinated way, it was fascinating how hard that was. And I even think about sitting at one of the first meetings with our prescription vendor, and about 85% of the people in our prescription plan use a prescription in a year, which was comparable to the city itself, but it was a lot. And we're sitting in the room, and I remember going over the list of medications, and like there were no HIV medications. And I just said to the vendor, like, I know we have 20,000 people in the plant. Somebody has HIV and somebody has medication. Like I refuse to believe that. And they're like, good question, DeRay. I think we just left it off the chart. And I'm like, I don't even, I'm like not a medical professional, right? I just like know enough to be dangerous in the room. And I'm in the room, and you're like, whew, if I hadn't thought about this, like we would actually be planning at the system level in a way that isn't making sense. So when I think about running for mayor, it was this question of like, how do we change systems and structures in a way that makes sense? One of the things I'll never forget was going to all those forums, and it made me appreciate how little the public is primed for real answers. So like when the public asked the panel, like, what are you gonna do about education? People one by one would be like, school system is broken, I'm gonna fix it. And people would cheer. And you're like, that was not an answer, right? But that is like what people are just used to. And like that was interesting, how we've not yet developed a public language about solutions in a way that makes sense across a host of areas, health being really hard. And when I ran for mayor, it was this conversation about how do we think about health beyond hospitals, right? But like most people think about health as like the doctor and like in a clinic or something like that, but how do we think about mobility and how do we think about all the preventative stuff that doesn't happen necessarily in a hospital, and how do we give people language to start to do that work?
The other thing in that conversation that you had, you really elevated that conversation, and I can imagine, but I remember it was standing room only at many of these mayoral forums where people really were interested in what was going on. You started talking about a program of homelessness and how you thought about homelessness and some of the stats regarding it. Could you just share a little bit of that with us? Because again, we know if there's no place to live, there's no place to get healthy.
Yeah, so what the research would suggest is housing first. If any of you know the housing first strategy, this idea that what most people do is like if you're addicted or if you have any other problem, that people try and service the problem first and then find people housing. But what the housing first strategy suggests is that housing is the single biggest determinant of well-being. So instead of trying to like service somebody's addiction first, like give them a house or like find housing for people and then start to think about the solutions. What's interesting though is that cities like Baltimore, like the public housing waiting list is like tens of thousands of people and like a couple hundred get off a year, right? And like at that rate, it's not going to make a difference. And one of the things that I worry about that's happened in the public conversation is that we have forgotten how to imagine, like we've forgotten how to think about the world without the constraints. So I was talking to a leading scholar on housing, and I said to her, if I gave you $1 billion and I told you that we need to clear the public housing waiting list and not recreate the projects, like how would you do it, right? Like just trying to figure out like what would the thought experiment be that would get us to the other side. And after like 30 minutes on the phone, what I realized is that she was like, DeRay, there's just not enough housing. I'm like, I know, that's why I gave you $1 billion, right? Like I get it. She just couldn't think about the problem without thinking about the constraints. And there's something about the way that trauma traps you in the present, like because we're so close to the work and so close to the trauma, like we see the present every single moment. And like part of the imagining work has to be about thinking about this beyond the constraints so that we can start to imagine what systems can do differently. Because we did it for white people. You know, you think about like wealth in this country, it's like white people didn't just work hard for them as a race to have wealth. Like we made the middle class out of thin air. Like we did that. That's not like a controversial DeRay made it up. Like we literally did that. With redlining, we literally didn't give people of color like loans. Like we figured out how to set up a certain set of the population so they would succeed and disadvantage intentionally another part of the population. But when we talk about marginalized communities, like we can only see the constraint. And it's one of the really limiting and damaging things about how we imagine in public.
So again, one of the other things about in terms of health, you talked about also about addiction. And you know, there's a lot of conversation now about addiction and how it plagues the communities. And what were some of your ideas as you were bringing them up to the forums about addiction and some of your understanding of that?
So I have a podcast called Pod Save the People, and we've been fortunate to have a lot of great guests. So we had like Snowden and so many other people. But we had Michael Botticelli, who was the drug czar under Obama's administration on not too long ago. And I had to bring him on because I was on another podcast, and I said something like not wholly positive about methadone clinics. And I'm from Baltimore. Both my parents were addicted to drugs. My father raised us. My mother left when I was 3. She just came back when I was 30. So I grew up in a community of recovery, and I think about all the people I grew up with, like, didn't have much positive stuff to say about methadone clinics at all. So I said something about methadone clinics. All these doctors emailed being like, how dare you, da-da-da-da. Okay. So then we get Botticelli on, and one of the things that I realized is that there's just a lot more research on methadone clinics than there is on inpatient treatment. Like the research is just not equally weighed at all. So when we think about in a city like Baltimore, there just literally are not enough beds. So like if you wanted to send everybody who's addicted to inpatient treatment, like it is impossible. There's just not enough beds in the city. There are not even enough beds like in the geographic region. But one of the reasons why we've not rallied around like inpatient treatment as a solution is that like the research doesn't necessarily favor it. And what I said to all those people I fought that day is that like we are not sending wealthy white people to methadone clinics. We're not. As much as you might tell me that you think methadone is a solution, and I'm not even anti-methadone, but I do know that like for wealthy white people, they're getting inpatient treatment. Like that is what we're doing. We might be calling it something else, but they're going to a retreat and they're going to get help, whatever it is. But when we think about people of color and marginalized people, like we just don't, that's not how we think about the solutions. And like how do we start to name that so that we can actually talk about equity? And we think about the difference between equality and equity. Equality is the idea that everybody gets the same thing. Equity is that people get what they need and deserve. And the work of justice is almost always about equity.
Great. So you've recently passed. You have recently passed the 1 million followers mark on Twitter. So,
yes.
So what does that mean to have 1 million followers in cyberspace? And where are you leading people?
I think the beauty of the internet is that we can just accelerate the pace of change, right? So like I think about Snowden, who is in Russia, who stole the secrets, if you remember Snowden. is I watched Citizen 4 and I was tweeting about Citizen 4 and next day his lawyer texted me and was like, Ed would love to meet you. So like I go to this room that has this computer that Ed can control from Russia and we have this conversation. And that is only possible because of the internet and things like Twitter. And like that's really beautiful. I even think about the protesters that we didn't know each other's names. We knew each other's hearts and we knew each other's like Twitter names in the very beginning. And we were able to move people all across the country online and like that is beautiful. One of the things I worry about is I don't know if we're designed to take this much feedback. Like there's just you get so much feedback all the time and there's like a weight to that. And what does it mean to be in proximity to trauma every day, all day? Like it's already hard enough like outside, but the digital world is a place where like there's just, your proximity to trauma is so real. And again, the damaging thing about trauma is it traps you in the moment. So, the 1 million is interesting, and Beyonce follows me on Twitter, which is funny. Beyonce follows me on Twitter, and that happened 3 years ago, and I would get introduced places, and they'd be like, and DeRay is one of the 9 people Beyonce follows. So Twitter is like a beautiful, beautiful place. It doesn't replace the offline organizing, though. There'll always be important things to do offline. And I think about places like Baltimore. We had a school last year where 6 kids got killed either on the way to or from school, right? And that's a different type, that's a trauma. And like, how do we teach kids? How do we think about the health of neighborhoods when that is so real for people? And you add the internet trauma to that too. I was in Chicago talking to a former gang leader, and he was like, you'll never believe the single biggest reason why people get killed. And he was like, it's the internet. He's like, it used to be that like you at least had to know the person, but now it's like you say something slick on Facebook and all of a sudden you have like a mortal enemy that you've never seen before. And I was like, I hadn't thought about that. So like, I think there's a beauty about the way we can build community. I think that we've not yet seen the full scope of the danger.
Well, it's funny. We've listed that Fortune magazine called you one of the world's greatest leaders in 2015. And then the Time magazine called you one of the 30 most important people on the internet.
The internet.
Yeah. So again, we've had so much trouble and trauma around the damages with the hurricanes and other things that are going on like that. Have you seen a lot of that traffic going on in terms of people calling out for need? And has there been any response that you've seen that where the internet has really helped in those situations now that wouldn't have helped before?
Yeah, I think about the mobilization on Puerto Rico. I think about all of these things. Like the internet was a game changer, especially because the federal government has sort of like abdicated its responsibility with regard to public health in this moment. So I think that has been huge. I just had a conversation with Christy Todd Whitman, who used to be the administrator at the EPA, first female governor of Virginia, New Jersey, not Virginia. Virginia is great for another reason because we just had good wins, but New Jersey. And she was talking about like the ways that the EPA manages in communities that we don't think about. So one of the things she said that I thought was interesting, she was like, with the fires happening in California, she's like, we always struggle to tell people to not move the debris. She's like, the fire ends and people like go in and they want to like rummage through their stuff and don't know that they're inhaling things that we haven't tested yet. And I was like, I hadn't thought about that, right? So how do we use these platforms to help people get proximity to information that they never would otherwise? And I think that is really fascinating. I was at this dinner with Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, not too long ago, and he was like, DeRay, it's so beautiful that people are protesting all across the country. And I was like, Eric, where were you 3 years ago? 3 years ago, it was not beautiful that we were in the street. Like your administration was not, you weren't giving us kudos for being protesters. But suddenly, now that the face of protest has changed, it's like the most American thing that can happen. So I'm hopeful that this will outlast this presidency. There's some people who think that the history of injustice in this country began with the Muslim ban. And the reality is this country was bad for a lot of people way before the Muslim ban. And not that the Muslim ban is not a bad thing, it is a bad thing. And there are a lot of things happening now that are really problematic. But this has been a long struggle for so many people. And I want to make sure that this energy exists again after this presidency.
So we've been talking about health disparities for the last 2 days here, and we've been talking about health, and we've been talking about the system, and I don't know, we can argue back and forth, but I'm not sure how much progress we've made so far to make the population healthier. Do you think this platform can help us? And if it can help us, how does it help us? How can it help us?
Yeah, I think about when I was a chief human capital officer, we would always try and figure out, and you know this better than I do, like why are men not getting physicals? We sit in the room, we're like, why are these people not getting physicals? And our healthcare plan was the best healthcare from a cost perspective in the country. It was a $5 copay and we cover 100% of the cost. It was killing us as a district financially, but in terms of like the cost of employee, it literally was $5 and we covered 100% of the cost for every single thing that you could get. Like that was our plan. The most expensive copay was $10, and that was if you were out of network, and nothing was out of network. So you know, nobody was not getting service because they couldn't afford it, because like the plan was so wild that like, and we had been trying to negotiate something different, some cost sharing. Our employees paid, I think they paid like $40 a year for prescription. I mean, it was just like very, very cost effective for the employee, nightmare for the district. But we could not figure out like why people weren't going to the doctors. It was like a really wild sort of thing. And at the end of my time there, I was there for a year, we were starting to think about this differently. Like, what could it look like to give people, everybody who had been to the ER last year, like what if we sent them a list of the urgent cares close to them? Like that was something we piloted. That took us literally a year to try and get permission to do. It was like, it was wildly hard. Like Care First was like, we don't know if we can do it. We're like, I don't need to know the names of the people. Like you can send them, but we just want them, like how are people, you know, they were telling me like, DeRay, the emergency room costs too much. I'm like, I agree. They should go to urgent care. But it's like, how will they know what urgent care? And they're like, Google. And I'm like, that can't be our strategy, right? Like we should, like, you know, I know the subscribers, they're part of our plan. Like, can we tell them the urgent care close to them? And like that actually was like a remarkably hard thing to try and figure out. And I think about those, we thought those are the easy, I thought that was gonna be like the easy thing. We send people something, da-da-da. And like that was actually really, really hard in a way that was sort of fascinating. I think about too, after we talked to a lot of public health professionals in the city of Baltimore about people being afraid to get tested for STDs because they were afraid to, not because they were afraid of the results, which is what people thought, but because they were afraid of seeing people that they knew at the nurse's office. So like in a small city, it's like you might have gone to school with the phlebotomist or the receptionist and like you just didn't want to go. So we were piloting at the end, sending test kits to people's homes that they can mail in. So trying to think about this issue differently. I think about the first time I'd ever gotten tested before. I had never had sex. I went because people were like, you should get tested. And it took a really long time to get an appointment. It was like sort of a wild, like if I was dying, it would have just been, I'd have been out because it's really hard. And I was a senior leader in the district back then, so I was able to move all my meetings around. Like I could make it work, but I was in the minority. And it's like, how do we make the system work for people who like teach all day, right? And like they can't just like skip their period to go to the doctor. And the second thing is I'll never forget the doctor that day because it was this weird, he sort of looked at me like, why are you getting tested if you don't have any symptoms, why are you getting tested? And it's like, well, I thought everybody was like, I thought I was gonna come in and they're gonna be like, get tested, testing's so great. Because that's like what the commercial said. But instead, it was sort of this conversation about like, why are you here? And I was like, well, that's not what I thought was gonna happen. And I think about those things as like tying into why the health issue is like harder than it has to be, that it's not a money thing for people, but it's all of these other issues.
Got it. Well, listen, I know there are questions out there. So we've got mics set up. And DeRay, if you don't mind taking some questions from the audience, I would love to get some feedback and some audience questions from our group.
So thanks very much for your time. I actually moved to Columbia, Missouri, so not too far down the road from St. Louis.
God bless you.
And started my job on July 7th of 2014. And
wow.
when Ferguson happened, my family in Canada emailed me and said, are you okay? And I said, well, yes. I'm 2 hours away from St. Louis. But a question that I have, and I've seen it over the past 3 years, is whenever there are police shootings involving black men or other people, things seem to reignite in St. Louis. And I'm just wondering if you could share your thoughts with us about that happening. Is it always a positive thing? Are there potential negative consequences of protests arising in other cities where maybe they're trying to work on improved relationships between the community members and law enforcement?
Yeah, I remember the last meeting we had with Obama and the last disagreement he and I had, and he was like, DeRay, people should vote. If people care about the country, they should vote. And this is a fight we had with Hillary too. Hillary's like, people should vote. And we were like, people should vote. People should do a lot of things, right? People should go to the doctor, they don't go to the doctor. People should vote. And we were saying to them that like shaming people into voting is never gonna be the solution. And if we talk about voting as like one way to build power, then like that I think will be an entrance. And I voted my entire life. I still got tear gas, I got arrested, I got pepper sprayed, I got mace. Like voting wasn't the thing that stopped all of those things from happening. And I start there because for so many people, the only time they've ever been heard is standing in the middle of the street. They called, they emailed, they texted, they wrote the letter, and like it didn't matter. But standing in the middle of the street was like the thing that forced the system to respond. So all the protesters, we know that protest is not the answer, right? That like standing in the street alone is not enough. But we do know that it opens up space for the answer to emerge. So it was in standing in the street that like we got to have an oversight board in St. Louis, right? And like all of those things. And St. Louis actually has the highest rate of police killing in the country, which is one of the reasons why I think the protests always ignite there. And the movement was born there, that like the original spirit of protest started in St. Louis, so I think it starts there. You know, I don't think that it takes away from the other energy about like sitting at the table. And I say that as somebody who's like been at the table and stayed in the street. I think that staying in the street like forces the system to like stay attuned to the issue. So when I got arrested in Baton Rouge, I didn't plan to get arrested. It was, I had to go back to work. I was a chief human capital officer. I got hired and I was like, I'm gonna be low key. I'm not gonna do anything. And then like third day I'm in jail and it's like a thing. And I think about that because one of the ways that we used the arrest was to like file a class action lawsuit against the city of Baton Rouge. And I was just in Baton Rouge last night and we got a win that like the protesters had never gotten before, and that was really important. So I think it's like an either or, not a both and. Or a both and, not an either or.
Steve?
How you doing today? I have a question about around civil rights activism and history. Do you find that we are repeating history? I do a lot of history-based lectures around civil rights, and one of the things that I find is folks are not aware that we are repeating a pattern, that we have been in this space before. I'm going to give you an example. When I talk about the African American experience with the police department, I give them an allegory. It was basically like I said, if I'm standing here, my father's standing here, my grandfather's standing here, my great-grandfather is standing next to him, and we go down that line, do you think the relationship with the police department gets better or worse as you go down throughout history? So are we ahistorical when it comes to even kind of like civil rights protests?
You know, I like that phrase that says history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I think that what is different in this moment is the access to tools. And like I can talk to a million people in 1 second in a way that they just couldn't do before. It wasn't that they didn't have the skills, it was like the technology just didn't exist. And I think that has allowed us to do something different. We know that we didn't invent resistance and we didn't discover injustice in August of 2014, right? That this is like a struggle much longer than us. I do think we also just have more data. So you think about any number you've ever heard about police violence in the country, it all comes from newspaper reports. If you get killed in the country and a newspaper doesn't write about it, you're not in the data set. The federal government doesn't collect data, so the CDC data on police violence has about half the number of people who we know have been killed. The FBI just under Comey said they would collect the data. It's gonna be lagged by about 2 years, so the 16 data will come on 18. So any number you've ever heard in any real time comes from newspaper reports. And there are a lot of challenges with that, as you can imagine, but like in some towns in Texas, it looks like white people are being disproportionately killed more than people of color, and we think that is because if your name is like John Smith, they're just coding you as white, not Latino, like if you're Latino. So like we just have more data in a way that I do think sets us up to be different in the fight, and I'm hopeful that we can have bigger conversations about what solutions look like just because we have access to more data. I do worry about things like the racial wealth gap, and not to go down that path too deep, but it will be 0 in 2053 for Black people, which is wild, is that I was talking to one of the leading scholars on it, and she was like, DeRay, we talk about financial literacy all the time, like people want to put financial literacy classes in every single high school. And she's like, poor people know how to manage their money better than anybody in the middle class because they have to, right? That like, it's not about like their literacy level, like they know that the difference between $20 today and $20 tomorrow is a huge difference. It's that they don't have assets, right? That like, they can learn all they want about 401k and nothing to put in it that doesn't actually matter. And she was talking about things like the post office used to be a bank into the 70s. I had no clue, right? Like what if we took all the red line communities and drew green lines around them and just like invested in them and the way that we didn't invest in them intentionally, right? So like, if I worry about anything, it's not the ahistorical nature. I worry about the way that pessimism has become cool in this moment, that people have become so attuned to critique that we prize that more than we prize creation, right? That people are like trying to deconstruct the world, and then you're like, well, what world should we live in? And they're like, I don't know. And you're like, well, that's not helpful. So I worry about that more than anything.
Yes.
Yes, I had a question for a statement you made about public language. I really like the fact that you stated that we don't have a public language around certain areas. One thing would be education. I think another thing we could say would be healthcare. And I was curious if you had any thoughts as to what that would look like. How do we go about creating that? And do you think social media can be helpful or detrimental to that? Because with Twitter, you can just put out your statement in 150 characters. And I think if you look at the last presidential election, most of the things that the points people jumped on were those very short little tweets, if you might call that maybe a public language. And that's what people got on board, but they didn't get on board. They weren't ready for really thought-provoking, real good thoughts. And I think we saw when anybody presented something that actually had real data or thoughts, it was quickly dismissed and people just jumped on just these tweets, essentially.
Yeah, I think that, I think one of the, if you've ever lied, which all of you have done, you work really hard on the lie because like you need to defend it. So like the lies are just like sort of slick in their essence. When you're right sometimes you get a little lazy, and I think that the left is like lazy because we're right about so much of it. It's like people should have healthcare. It's not like that's not like a radical thing. It's sort of like people should have healthcare. And I think that sometimes in these moments, it's like our response to like death panels, which was like a slick lie, this idea that there were death panels, the left's response was like a 10,000 word response. You're like, well, yeah, we know that's not true, but you saying it in 20,000 words is actually not helpful, right? Like nobody can repeat that. Nobody understands it. Even the last healthcare debates, I'm not convinced people know any more about healthcare besides they should have it, right? Like they do know about like the birth control provision maybe, but like the other things, like I think people just know that they should have it. And there is something about like, how do we give people language? My goal is always like aunts and uncles can repeat at the dining room table. Like if we can figure out how to get it so like aunts and uncles can repeat at the dining room table, I think we've won. But so much of the left's messaging, like you need like 2 degrees and like 2 hours to digest it. And like, I think that just doesn't. So when I think about public education, it's like, what is a good teacher? What is a good school? Are like the 2 foundational questions, and nobody's owned the public conversation about those. Like when I think about healthcare, it's like, what does it mean to be healthy at home? What does it mean to be healthy at work? Like I think there are ways that we can sort of like put this in buckets that people are like, okay, healthy at home means blah, 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 and like healthy at work means blah, 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 and like healthy at, like, how do we add a little more contour to it in a way that like regular people sort of get and understand, I think has to be part of the work.
Ron?
Good afternoon. I guess I'm looking for, can you hear me okay? I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I'm in a privileged class. I've lived, the reality you talked about, and I also live a different reality now. Because of my class, I'm able to have access to people who normally probably wouldn't talk to me, because I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I also have access to people who are, x-ray techs, nurses, other people who I talk to because it's who I am. I don't think I'm better than anyone else or below someone. But I find that we're so far apart in these issues, whether healthcare, policing, what have you. But because of my access, whether it be on Facebook or being in the working environment, it's an opportunity to kind of share dialogue. I'm happy to hear that you have dialogue with police officers and other people as well. I have family members of police officers who have some of the same fears that I have. I'm just trying to figure out some of the tips that I could use because we live in different realities. I mean, I can talk down blue in my face with, let's say, the x-ray tech I work with every other Thursday at the prison system. And he happens to be, he's a white guy who has his own views, have my views as well. But he talks to me because I'm a doctor and I get a chance to share what I feel. But they always are so surprised that, wow, they expect me to be, because I'm conservative about some things from an economic standpoint, but at the same time expect me to be totally right-wing because I'm an orthopedic surgeon. They're surprised sometimes when I share with them that certain things have happened to me. They're like, whoa, wow, you're so nice. I'm like, dude, it's not that, it's just that things happen. Right. And I find that getting that conversation started is important. Right. No, really, it's happened many times. I have former patients who say, wow, I can't believe that happened to you. I mean, dude, it's like so we live in different realities. And we hold tight to realities so tight, and we're unable to even talk to someone else. Even when they're inundated with information, we can't let go. So how do we what tips do you have now in the conversations to help me and others who have the forum to help communicate both sides of the issue?
Before you answer, one thing I didn't ask about was some of the work you've done around police contracts and everything. So that may dovetail into your answer with Teron.
Yeah, I think about 2 things. One is, and Colin's a friend. Colin Kaepernick is a friend, and I was talking to Colin not too long ago, and this conversation about not letting people make basic things seem controversial. It's like, I didn't kill anybody. The police kill people. I didn't kill anybody, right? And I don't know I wasn't there when Mike Brown got killed. I wasn't there when Alton Sterling got killed. But what I do know is that they should be alive today. Like, that is like the basic truth, that we've seen white people jaywalk and they didn't get killed, right? That like, this is a choice. And like, it's not controversial to be like, we should live in a world where the police don't kill people. Like, I don't think that's like a deep, crazy, sort of wild statement. And there are people who want that to be this controversial statement, and like I think the NFL has done a successful job of sort of making that suddenly like a wild thing, and like I think we have to push back at that at every step of the way. The second part is like sharing the cognitive burden. That one of the things that we do when we think we're right, like morally right, is that we start preaching and we don't know we're preaching. So like somebody's like, DeRay, what do you think? And I'm like, but da 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 da, and they're like, but duh, and I'm like, but da da da, and so like I'm actually taking all the cognitive burden in this. They are just saying like 2 or 3 words in disagreement. And like we have to flip that. So like I was on a panel once and a police officer said to me, DeRay, well, when should the police be able to kill somebody? Because I'm like, the police shouldn't kill people. She's like, when should they be able to kill somebody? And I'm like, well, when can a police officer kill your child? And she's like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, I don't know either, right? Like, if you can't tell me like name the circumstances where when your child does something wrong, they should kill them, then I'm with you, right? Like if you think that your child jaywalking should be killed by a police officer, then kill all the jaywalkers, right? Because they're gonna kill yours first, then I'm down. But people don't do that, And I wanted to put the cognitive burden on her. That like I wanted to take it off me because I already knew what I was thinking. I wanted her to think through her thoughts deeply, and she like bowed out completely. And I think that in so much of this, it's like you setting up the conversation so people have to like dig deeper and they have to do some of the work as opposed to like you preaching. And I think that like applies for most ththings in the toolkit of how do we help people think about it. When I think about the Colin stuff, it's like, it's only people of color that can't, like Colin can't be an athlete and somebody who thinks the world has to be better, right? We've said, the narrative has been set up that he has to choose, that like he couldn't possibly be like, people shouldn't be killed in the street and play football. But like white people get to coexist as everything, right? They get to like go to work and they can be a doctor and they can go to PTA meetings, and that's not like a conflict, right? But it's with people of color that it's this idea that like if you believe in any way that the world can be a better place, like that has to be the core part of your identity. And like that's like a weird thing. Like how do we like push people to dig deeper in those things? I think has to be it. And I think it is rooted in like the sharing the cognitive burden part of it and not letting people make simple things seem controversial.
Do you think you'll ever change the name of the organization?
So,
or push someone to change the name? Because I know it's been demonized to some extent.
Yeah, and there's a difference between like the movement and the organization. So there was no organization that started the movement. When we were out in the street, we had no clue that Black Lives Matter would become the phrase that we used. I get that people are frustrated by it. It's weird to me that I'm so frustrated by inequity and poverty and those sort of things that like, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about like the phrase itself, but I think that, the Civil Rights Movement was a decade-long worth of activism. We're about 3 years in. So we'll see like what the nomenclature at the public level looks like in a couple years. I'm open to it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bringing things back to healthcare a little bit, I've observed in my clinical practice that most of my colleagues who are white, because I work in an overwhelmingly white profession, only know very generally about things like the Tuskegee studies and that the U.S. Public Health Service inoculated Guatemalans with STDs, et cetera. But our patients who are of color or Hispanic, Latino, they know about these things. Because you've been working with people from the other side of the aisle and working on solutions, how would you suggest that we talk to each other as healthcare professionals to try to improve awareness and get people to understand why some people may not trust us because of historical mistreatment of people, and to recognize that we may be perpetuating disparities by not addressing that or not thinking about that?
Yeah,
Before you answer, we're starting to sort of push up against time, so we've had a little strategy we've been doing that I think works well. Why don't I have all the participants who have questions just articulate your questions, and then maybe you can frame it in a all together.
I'll take notes.
My name is Kristen Zalakoffer. I live in Chicago.
Okay.
I live on the south side of Chicago, and every morning on our news, we hear of more shootings. And we also are a very resilient city. It's a very strong people. We push back on all of the issues that matter to us. But what I see is protests on a regular basis. And you wait, there's one protest for a killing, then you see another one in the next week. It's very reactive, and it's almost numbing because we don't hear of the solutions. So how can we take the next steps from protests to actually celebrating the outcomes and the wins, and actually partnering with the media to make sure that those wins and outcomes are known?
Dr. Lay?
Thank you. My question relates to your thoughts on the challenge of dealing with the proliferation of fake news and alt news, particularly with the internet disseminating that in other media. And the background, in just a few sentences, is that one of the most powerful books I read by the political scientist Robert Spector at Stanford was called Agnotology, The Cultural Production of Ignorance and Doubt, and sort of looking at how lots of data gets written out there, but there are forces that challenge that, usually forces in power, whether it's in women's health, archaeology, climate science, et cetera. So the question is, I used to believe we do all the research, we put it out there, maybe it'll convince people, but what in fact can we do when also the media can now disseminate all kinds of fake and alt news to serve other purposes?
Great. Great.
So follow the money. On the topic of solutions, living on the south side of Chicago as well, we know healthcare disparities, at least at the doctor-patient relationship, the real way to improve that is having more doctors that represent the patient. In terms of police violence, I noticed that, the African Arts Fair, most of the police officers there are white. Nightlife, parties, clubs on the south side, a lot of white police officers. And I didn't realize, taking care of a lot of police officers, just in terms of what I do, that the reason, because my solution was have black police officers in black communities at these type of events, especially where there's a lot of youth involved, games, high school games, black high school games where 90% of the people there are black and the police force is white. And I didn't realize until later in this process that the reason is all about money, right? The white cops are getting the preferential overtime and bonus pay to work these off-shift events. So I'm sure you guys are dealing with that on the solution part, and I'll be curious to hear how you guys are handling that.
Julia?
So I'll be really quick. We've been talking a lot about racism and talking about saying it, naming it, talking about it at work. So I'm going to head back to New York in some of the ivory towers that I work in and be the only black woman at the table having a conversation. I'm curious about tools to unpack the conversation about Black Lives Matters. And when I say racism and Black Lives Matters, what else do I say after that to engage people in a meaningful discussion?
Good. Oh, and one more there.
Please. I just want to know, what do you think needs to change in society in general for being able, all the population in the USA at least, to achieve equality and equity?
Okay, so going down from the top, one of the first question about disparities made me think about the 3 biggest mental health facilities in the country are all jails. The biggest one is in Chicago. The Cook County Jail is the single largest mental health facility in the country. It's not a hospital. And Cook County used to have 18,000 inmates or detainees. The difference between prison and jail, if you don't know, jail is before you've been convicted mostly, and then prison's after you've been convicted. So Cook County Jail used to have 18,000 people. It has about 10,000 now, but it's the single biggest mental health facility in the country. I did a visit at Angola, which is the single biggest landmass prison. It's 28 square miles, 18,000 acres. Used to be 4 plantations. It is now 1. And they run, and most of the people in Angola are lifers. Like they'll be there. They either have life without the possibility of parole or life with the possibility. But they run, if any of you have ever been, or if any of you ever want to go, they run a hospice program, like the inmates run a hospice program. So when people are dying, like the inmates are with you, like it's a whole sort of experience, and that's really interesting. When I think about the disparities, I'm reminded that, or how do we teach people the disparities, is that the way we set the curriculum is like always a choice. And one of the ways that whiteness works is that when Baldwin said whiteness is a metaphor for power, he was trying to help people understand that the way whiteness shows up is not only like overt white supremacy and like lynching and enslavement, like that is how people think about it, but it shows up in like the much more insidious ways about like what we deem worthy of even being taught to people, right? And I think about, I was on Twitter and I said something like, watch whiteness work or something about something. And this guy in Hollywood emailed me and he's like, DeRay, I almost unfollowed you. I was really offended by like sort of the broad way that you said whiteness. You should have said white supremacy. And I just wrote him back like, send me your number, let's talk this out. So we get on the phone and he's like, I hope you learn. Like he's sort of patronizing about it, but it's like, let's work through this. And then I say to him like, you know how you read every single book you read, the characters are white until they're named other? And he's like, yeah, I never thought about that. When I read scripts, every character's white until they're not white. And I'm like, that's power, right? Like that's not how we think about white supremacy and like racism. That's not lynching. Like that is the way power works. Like when white becomes like the default. So the fact that what some white people say is that I worked really hard. They're like, I worked hard for my da-da-da. It's like, you didn't work hard for every Band-Aid to look like you. That wasn't like you. Like you personally didn't do that, right? That is like the way whiteness is working, and I think that that's like also a function of like what we choose to teach people. That like we center some people's stories and narratives because that is what dominant culture does, and like that's a choice. And I never forget that this is a choice. So that's that. The thing about reactive, so I don't think it has to be like protest. I don't think the shift is like protest to politics. I think about power being the ability to influence the decision-making process and politics as the decision-making process. So protest is one way to influence the decision-making process, and I think that is like a real thing. I think that being at the table has to be a part of that solution at some point. There's some people that we stood in the street with who were incredible in the street, and the table was just not their place. Like it wasn't where they felt comfortable, or where they wanted to be, and that was okay, right? So how do we create space for everybody to be in where they can actually shine and do the best work? I think that should be part of our conversation. And remember that the people are in the street because injustice is still real. Like none of us want to be, like as many streets as I've been in, like I don't want to be in the street. Like who wants to get tear gassed? I don't want to get tear gassed. I don't want to get arrested. Like people do it because they have to. And like, you want people to get out of the street, like stop the bad things from happening. And then everybody will go home. I think about as much success as the protesters have had, it's like I think about all the things I'm not doing. I think about all the books I'm not reading, all the time I'm not spending with my niece and nephew or people I love because I'm fighting this larger systemic stuff. Like that is a choice that we feel compelled to make because the world can be better and we know it can. When I think about the fake news, we just met with Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, and I just had another call with the VP of Policy at Facebook talking about this specific issue. 150 million people were exposed to the Russian ads. That's more people than voted last year, which is sort of wild. And I think that some of it is like the digital literacy. Like, how do we make sure that the platforms take some responsibility for the impact that they have? I think that they are sort of trying to figure it out. I think they need to. I'm less concerned about the public stuff. I think they'll figure that out. I'm actually more concerned about the private stuff. So they have private Instagram accounts that like 200,000 people follow that are Nazi accounts. And like the algorithms that they have set up are predicated on you reporting it, but it's like, how do you report a private account? You don't. The secret Facebook groups were started with the best of intentions. There were people in countries that couldn't organize publicly. So these secret Facebook groups were like the only way people could get together. But what happens when the KKK is a secret Facebook group? Like, we don't have a mechanism to deal with those things yet. And I'm not a technology apologist, but the internet is not making people racist. Like, people are racist before they got online, right? The internet might be helping them realize that they aren't racist and alone. I think that is happening. The internet is also helping them like get new language to be more racist, but it is not like making them racist. So how do we start to realize that this is like a mindset issue that like was not, the internet didn't make the issue a problem, the internet amplified the problem. And I think that that has to be like the way that we think about this too. They're young people who are seeing these racist memes, think it's funny and they're sharing it, but there was something about them that made them share it in the first place. Because there are a lot of people seeing the racist memes and they're like, that's racist. And you're like, okay. So I don't think we shouldn't blame that on the internet. I don't think that's the internet's fault. The thing about the policing and overtime, so the overtime issue is like an underexplored issue. It is a real problem. Like I think about that, I think it's like the 5 highest paid municipal employees in the city of Baltimore police officers, specifically because of the overtime issue. So real problem. And what the police would say is nobody wants to be a police officer, blah, blah, blah. So like that's sort of their thing, but we would never allow that in another profession. If there were teachers, I can tell you as a human capital officer, if there were teachers making $200,000 a year, like the public would lose their mind over that. But the police have done such a great PR job of sort of saying like the only way X can be safe is if I am X, right? Like they've set up this equation that they are the fulcrum of safety. And when people ask like, am I against the police? It's like, no, this is not about the police. This is about safety, that we believe three things. There will always be rules, there will always be people who break the rules, and there will need to be consequences. And the questions become, what are the consequences? What are the worst consequences, and who enforces them? And that is the crux of the issue. For some people, the police would like you to believe that they should enforce the consequences, they should make the consequences, that they determine like the worst consequences. And we would say is that just doesn't have to be the case. What is interesting though is that this is, and this goes back to what I said in the interview with Colbert, is that this is not about individual officers, this is about a system. So you think about the city of Chicago, is that in Chicago, there's a clause in the contract that says that officers, the disciplinary records of officers gets destroyed every 5 years. There is no if we said that to you, like every time, if we just threw away your discipline records every 5 years, the public would be like, we need to know if the doctor killed somebody. Da-da-da. But when the police, we're just like, let us do it. There's a clause, there are clauses in cities that say things like the officer has to be disciplined in the least embarrassing way to the officer and the department. You're like, I don't know what that means. In Austin, the police officers get access to every single piece of the investigatory file before they can be interrogated. No private citizen has that right? So when we talk about a system that is, it's just a different system. It's not even like one I do dislike it, but it is like it's like literally a different set of rules. And a different set of rules that we would never allow for any other public facing servant, not for doctors, not for teachers, not for elected officials, but for the police. Like we are so hooked on this idea that the only way we can be safe is if they have these protections. And like that just can't be the way that we set it up. I think that overtime sort of falls into that like if we take overtime away, then like chaos will reign. Chaos is already reigning in a lot of places, you know? Like in Baltimore, this would be the first time in the history of the country where more people are killed in the city of Baltimore than the city of New York. That is why there's 600,000 people in Baltimore. It's like millions of people in New York City, right? So like that can't be the way that we allow the system to set up, and it'll take people like you. People expect the protesters to be upset about it. They don't expect people with relative privilege to be like, well, the system should just work differently. And part of all of our work has to be about how do we help you understand that you have power in these moments, that when we think about what it means to empower people, it's not about giving you power. I can't give you power. Like, I'm not God. You have the power you have. Is what we can do is help you find the power that you have and help you understand that power and then use it. And that is, I think, at the root of like what the protests have been. Tools to unpack racism. The tools question. I forgot the tools question. Who asked the tools question?
Jillian being in the room.
Oh, you were.
Yeah, being in the room, being the only African American in
Yes.
the room and addressing it.
I think that it's funny. I think that people always want us to be angry when we talk about inequity, right? So they do something wild and they want me to like jump across the table, and it's like, you know, I can be pretty chill and say like that was problematic, right? And I think about when I got to I was the #2 human capital in Minneapolis. I was in head of all staffing in Minneapolis. And when I got there, Minneapolis has one of the biggest disparities in outcomes of students of color in the country. It's like wild, and it's a wealthy city, 5th highest concentration of Fortune 500 companies. Minnesota is one of the only states that has had a surplus, like at the state level. So it's not like there's no money. It's not like the public infrastructure is falling. They have problems that cities have, but it's very different. But kids of color are doing like really bad, and that's one of the reasons why I went, because I was like, I want to Baltimore. The city is struggling, and that's how people explain the school system struggling. But in Minneapolis, like the city isn't necessarily struggling in the same way. So I wanted to go and see. And I'll never forget the first meeting I was in, and we had wild disparities. So when I got there, we were dealing with all these discrimination complaints in the hiring process. So I said 2 things immediately. We will just interview everybody that wants to be a teacher. We're interviewing everybody. They're like, we can't do that. I'm like, we'll figure it out. So we interview every single person. And the second is we put these questions in place. But before that, I get in this room with like the head of ELL, like English language learners. And there's this like recruitment plan for English language learner teachers that didn't really make sense to me, but I just got there like 5 days in. And we're in this room, and I'm like, you know, we're gonna revise the plan, get it back to you. And she is like, and I'm young, I'm 32 now, I was probably 29 then, as like the second most senior person in the district in this capacity. And she looks across the table, it's like a meeting of like 5 people, and she's like, you just got here, like we're not doing anything different, right? And I remember sitting there being like, in my head, I'm like, if I was older, you wouldn't say that to me. If I was a white man, you definitely wouldn't say that to me. And I just remember looking at her being like, you will never say that again, like you won't ever talk like that again to me, and we're gonna redo the plan, does that make sense? And she is like, you know, but she was ready for me to like go, right? And I'm like, we don't even have to do that. Like, this is not, we are never gonna do that again, right? Like, we'll just never hire any teacher for you, but we're just not doing that. That's not gonna be the way that we interact. And it is, in my experience, that's always been really disarming to people because they are like ready for battle, you know? And it's like, we can go toe to toe, but the way that we go toe to toe doesn't always have to look like contentious in the way that you want it to. And I think about that with like the race stuff. I can talk about the fact that we gave white people wealth and didn't give it to anybody else. It's like, it's just a fact. Like, I don't need to be enraged about it. Like, it is real, you know? And I think that we should figure out a way to normalize the way we talk about the damage in inequity because it happened, right? Like, I remember it because it happened, not because I glorify it, not because I want to repeat it, but like, we made the middle class out of thin air for white people. Like, that is a fact, right? And like, we should be able to say that. So I think about like, one of the tools is figuring out how to deliver it like as clearly as possible. And like, people want the emotion, like that's what they want from you. And like, I think that you should rob them of that, like every single time. And like, I think that is, and like deliver it really clear and like make people just sit with the truth, I think is really interesting. In Minneapolis, we started asking every single teacher we hired, we asked them, we asked 4 questions. The third question was, do you think that students from wealthy communities, or students from high need communities can achieve the same grade level standards as students from wealthy communities, right? That is what we asked everybody. And like 30% of the people said no. And it was fascinating because we just asked it, right? And like this one, I'll never forget this one woman, 25 years old, she says to me, like, DeRay, colored girls, you know, like, I don't think colored kids get, I'm like, what is going on? Like, what is, like, she's like, to me, and like, it's not even like a broken response. I mean, she's going there, she's like, you know, this colored girl, da da da. And I'm like, where am I? And like, I couldn't even write fast enough, like, never will work for us. But it was this moment of like, we need to set up a system that does the equity work, right? That this can't just be about like one-off sort of things, that we need to make sure that like this is embedded in the culture of this organization, that like we look for mindset as like an orientation. If you don't believe that every kid can learn, then like you just can't teach here. I can teach you classroom management, I can teach all this, like I can't teach you to believe that like the poor kid should learn, right? That's like I'm not willing to have that be something I inflict on our kids. And I think that we don't think enough about how do we bake equity into the organization, that like we make a chief equity officer who's sitting in the corner and never gets invited to meetings. And like, that's not actual equity, right? That if it's not a part of like the day-to-day experience for people, I think about power. One of the things that we do in classrooms is that we'll sit in the back of classrooms and we will tally the number of positive to negative remarks. So with most bad teachers, it's like 2 to 1 negative to positive. Like the things they say out of their mouths are just negative. Like sit down, be quiet, da da da. Like tally that versus the like, great job. Like you see the disparity actually really powerfully. And when you show that back to people, they're like, okay. And in meetings, one of the things that you could do is like who gets called on first is often in most places a sign of inequity. So in most places like white men get called on before or speak first, like because white people are used to being heard, right? So like in naming that for people, they don't realize that they never call on a woman ever first. Like in the meetings they run, it's always a man that speaks first. It's like a way that power is manifesting in the room that we like don't think about because we've been convinced that like racism only is like lynchings, right? And I think that we can like help people see those things. Like I think that has to be part of it. And the last question was about how do we win? I think that the solution at scale, like it has to be solutions at scale. So like, I think that starts with dreaming without the constraints. And like, I believe in programs, we should have programs. I think programs help people think about what systems can do differently. So like the Panthers Free Breakfast program in and of itself wasn't revolutionary. What was revolutionary about it is that it forced like the bigger system to be like, if these people in this neighborhood can give food to everybody, then like we can all give food to everybody, right? And like that's what programs do. Charter schools, whether you like them or not, convince so many people that these kids that we had given up on could be taught and they could learn. And I think that programs sort of push us to think about things at scale, but the scale solutions like are the only way that we will actually get free and like we can do it. So Trump just gave $700 billion to the military. It would only take $125 billion to take every single person below the poverty line up to the poverty. Like this is about a choice that we make as a society. It's not about resources. Like when white people were when white people were stuck, like we always found that we never had a question of like, were there resources? And like we think about what it means to be like a capitalist society, it's like, this isn't really capitalism. Like the government controls most of the markets, like you can't just like make a pill and give it to people. Like it's a heavily regulated market and like we can regulate this for good too. And that has to be part of the way that we think about it. So I'm biased towards like the biggest solutions, the things at scale. I think those will put us over. Thank you.